Well, thank you again for joining us at this month's Decoder webinar. If you've been riding along with us since the pandemic, get comfortable because we're going to do another deep dive. If you are new, I'd like to welcome you. This is a great opportunity for you to learn some insight on city planning, finances, and equity on a monthly basis with our team. This month's Decoder webinar is about new urbanism and planning for the next 100 years. So what does that mean? Well, first, 2 weeks ago, our team was able to attend the Congress of New Urbanism conference in Oklahoma City. And this is a conference that happens every year. It has over 16,000 attendees to convene to hear from speakers, participate in workshops, collaborate on projects, and learn new strategies from leaders in dozens of fields. This year, the theme was resiliency. So we're asking the questions, how can we touch on environmental issues, inequity, and wealth disparity in our community? For this webinar, I'm delighted to introduce you to our team who had the opportunity to speak in this year's conference. First, we have Josh McCarty, which is our resident geo-accountant, and today he'll be talking to you about public assets. We also have Philip Walters, who is our project manager, and we like to call him the bridge between our Chief Operating Officer, Kate Ryba, and Joe Minicozy. And lastly, we have Taylor Schenker, who is one of our analysts, and she'll be talking to you about what it looks like to be an urban planner from a community standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'd like to invite Josh to join us. So I'd like to start off with a question for you. You've been attending CNU for almost a decade now. So why don't you explain it to our audience, the history and what you think CNU is?
Yeah. Thanks, Maxine. And let's start out with this name, because it's kind of a funny name, right? It's I think it felt like a conference, felt like what a conference, you do at a conference, but it's called a Congress. And I've struggled with that for years now. And I think there's something important about that. I don't totally understand why it's a Congress. I think it's because the charter that they started out with is still active and still editable. But you can't tell your cab driver you're in town for a Congress because he'll try to fight you. And so it dawned on me this year the best way to explain what it really is. I think the best word is I'm going to call it Comic-Con for cities. Because that's what it feels like to me. Is you got a bunch of nerds who really they all nerds about the same thing, cities. We call it place. Like people can get in debates about that even, but it's a bunch of people who really love cities and place and get together to nerd out about it. Some people dress in costumes, things get wild, but that's the vibe that it has, and because it's a little more than a conference, and and that's sort of the experience of it, but the history of it, I think, why new urbanism, why is it new? Like we didn't just invent cities, and I think there's something important about that too, to set the stage in the context of the late 80s, early 90s when the CNU came about. By that time period, city planning and the way we make cities, especially in America, had become extremely auto-dominated. We were building everything for cars. The zoning code was for cars. We were building cities around parking, and it was really creating some really awful places. And a lot of the great stuff that we wanted to see, and I say we, I mean humans almost instinctively want their natural habitat of the human environment. This the town, the small city, the urban place, is mostly illegal all over the country. Because we had these old archaic zoning codes. And so these are the group of people who got together and said, hey, we could do better. We need to fight this together. And that's where that forum came from. And that's the forum we still have. And really, I have to express a lot of gratitude for the work that those folks did. It had to be really painful, frustrating work, convincing people, hey, could we just make the roads a little narrower? Things like that.
Understood. Thank you for the summary. So I'd like you to elaborate on CNU's influence on our work and where our works fit in.
Yeah, and a little hi to the ghost of Kate there. In a direct sense, Joe worked with and sought out, a lot of people when this work was when CNU was really getting off the ground in the 90s, attracted a lot of like-minded people who were thinking, yeah, like this is the kind of place I want to see, especially a lot of people who they go to somewhere like Europe or even places like Asheville that still had the bones, and they would see, hey, this is a better place than what we're building right now. And so in a direct sense, both CNU, going to CNU, me going to CNU, Joe going to CNU has directly influenced our thinking and been part of those conversations, but also setting the stage in the country for changing the conversation and getting us past a lot of the really archaic ways of thinking about cities. Putting parking everywhere, putting building. I mean, we saw some of this in Oklahoma City, some of the really destructive interventions that happened in urban renewal. And so moving us to the next generation of that and having this forum for the conversation has been really foundational to our work.
So I'm curious, who have been your personal inspiration with CNU? Like what talks really sparked a fire in you this year?
Well, I'll say, this in the past, it's been a lot of the folks whose books I had read. It was one of the really cool things about going to CNU for me is that when I first got interested, when I first started learning about this stuff, I was reading, all the things I could get my hands on. So certainly the books by some of the principal figures like Liz Plater-Zyberg and Andres Duany and Doug Farr. But in recent years, I think what's really inspired me this year is that we've been virtual the last two times for obvious reasons, and that first one that was supposed to be in Minneapolis that became virtual was also coincided. It was 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd, and I think it lit a fire for a lot of urbanists. What people at this conference, this Congress call themselves, we're urbanists. It sounds a little like a cult. But they said, okay, we're doing something, we're missing something. We're not connecting to the previously redlined and Black communities in this country, and we need to do that. And what I thought was really cool is I actually saw some impact of that the feelers went out from that time period, and at the same time we're coming out too from these neighborhoods where people were like, we know we want to do something better with our neighborhoods. We know there's more that could be happening. And the connections are getting made. And I think one in particular I'm very excited about that I'll mention because I hope to see this name again is the town of Tallahassee, Oklahoma, which is a small Black town that has made this partnership with CNU to try and leverage all these great ideas that come out of this forum that a lot of times we have to fight for because we're fighting against the prevailing car-dominated paradigm of planning.
Right. So it's like we have a group of founders and foundations, and now we're just branching it off. Like, how can we connect all the dots? That's maybe making me think about connecting one more dot, which is public assets. And I feel like I know that you've read the book Public Wealth of Cities by Decoder. So I'm wondering if you could tell the audience about the presentation that you did, which was about public assets.
Yeah, and we've had Dog on here, and so one of the things, a little bit of the chaos of a conference, my talk got shortened to just about 7 minutes, which in a way was a fun challenge for me because it meant I figured I could only make a few really good points, and one that I decided to put on the forefront. So this idea of public assets, I really wanted to bring that to CNU for a couple of reasons. One is that when I'm also at this point with the work we've done and the time I've spent on it, I'm using basically every opportunity to just reiterate that I do not believe that a single American community is fiscally solvent. And I almost feel like a climate scientist having to keep saying this because I'm seeing the numbers and they're not pretty. We have liabilities, we have infrastructure we need to pay for. We don't have the revenue, but we do have land. And so I think this is going to become, as these bills keep adding up, we're going to see this work more and more in our cities. And I think there's a particular role for new urbanists and the kind of folks who come to this conference. Maybe if you haven't been, maybe you check it out and see what I'm talking about. If you're that kind of nerd, but I think there's a mindset there of seeing the potential in a place, and especially where we have publicly owned land that is totally underutilized or just underutilized at all, that we could start fixing these problems, start creating revenue for our cities. And I think that mindset of seeing a place and how a site could fit into the bigger whole of the place, that's just the kind of mindset that people at CNU have.
Thank you so much for your input, Josh. So I'd like to zoom in a little bit. The CNU was located in Oklahoma City, which is very familiar territory for Philip Walters, both because he lived and worked there, but also because of Urban 3's work forecasting the cost of future growth in nearby Edmond. So Philip, tell us a little bit more about what the Congress of New Urbanism was like in Oklahoma City.
Sure, I would be happy to, Maxine, and I'm actually going to share my screen to help me do that. But it was, for me, it was a couple of things. Like Josh said, it's the gathering of my nerds, but it's also a homecoming. This was where I grew up as a planner, got to do a lot of different comprehensive planning things before coming here to Urban 3. And so like Maxine mentioned, we got to work in a suburb recently. So I have an example for you that I shared with the CNU group, and I'd love to get this group's take on because I think it's incredibly applicable. But just for a second, I think I was seeing some new urbanism happen in this place. This is Oklahoma County, and this is the standard Urban 3 approach. Let's figure out what's going on here first in total value, which is like the total gas tank, then in value per acre, which is like miles per gallon. This is efficiency. And oftentimes we see things that you would call urbanist or urban walkable showing up in warmer colors here. It makes a lot more sense when I get it in 3D for you, right? And then actually all of Oklahoma City goes beyond Oklahoma County. So this is the place where I grew up as a planner, coming to understand urbanism myself. And I actually saw a lot of those purple spikes come into being. Some of them are, in fact, 50-story towers, but a lot of those, I'm going to zoom in a little more for you here, twisted the model a little. This is the tax productivity of kind of the core portion of town. And some of these red and purple spikes came on just in the last few years. It was fun for me to go home and see some buildings that weren't there before that are just 3- and 4-story buildings and that are still pulling up some of these really impressive productivities, really impressive values per acre, because they're just using their parcel way more effectively than some of that sea of green that standard single family homes here in this community. I'm going to go back one actually for you. There is an urban piece in this area, but if you look at it, there's an awful lot of this full of white spaces for roads that doesn't have very much on the way of productivity to help pay for those roads. And that's, I think, what Josh was getting at, and that I get to dig into a little more for you. I'm seeing a pattern here. Even when those great new buildings are coming in and into like named districts, that's how you really know a thing's a place. And it's showing up in my model. Paseo and Plaza and Midtown are productive, and they're named places. And then there's Penn Square. That's the mall too. It's a named place, but not quite as productive. But the rest of the city is really where I think the story's at, and where I think there's a story that's actually incredibly applicable, probably to many of the communities that the rest of the audience here may come into contact with. We call that geo-accounting. And I want to make sure that that's clear. I'm going to attempt to be agnostic here, even though I do have some opinions about this place. So Edmond, up at the top of that model, is one of the suburbs. They're all sort of the same. This one's technically its own political jurisdiction, right? But here it is, its legal boundary. I-35 runs up the middle of it. And I think you can tell the left half is sort of developed. I'd call that a lot of suburban development. A lot of that occurred in just the last 40 years or so. The eastern half is rather undeveloped. People who live there now think they live in a rural area. They were facing this concept of change, this challenge of, well, what are we going to do if that development keeps coming across the highway? And so we came to town to help them take a hard look at the financials of what is that going to mean. I'll point out while we're still on this map, there is the old core downtown in this community, but just like that larger region, that downtown is really a small fraction of what's happening here. So we're Urban 3, we go straight to the data. I don't want my biases in here. I want to find out what I can. And for this project, we had the pleasure of taking the whole community and dicing it into these grids, which was a really fun way to say, okay, here's a portion of your city, and it has all kinds of unique characteristics, all kinds of different revenue sources, but also all kinds of different costs underneath the ground. But when we dice it up in these grids, we can get a pretty good answer. What's it going to take to keep this community solvent and resilient going forward? Scaling that concept up a little bit. This is just an example. These are 3 grids right next to each other. The one on the right has some commercial. This place is unique. Retail tax is a big part of how they're funded. So although there's a lot of value per acre in all of these, there's a whole lot of revenue in that far right example because it has commercial, and that's just how they're set up. We know that the people spending money are coming out of those homes on the left, but this is how their system flows, and those are the costs they face in some of those grids. And so those are the revenues. That one on the right is way ahead, but that's good because it needs to subsidize those 2 on the left. What's that going to mean for the community? So I have to take one more little aside because as Josh said, new urbanism, right? It's a concept that's both maybe new and maybe not new. We're finding this over and over and over. And I really want to put this idea forward, which is exactly what CNU is for. I got to go out there and put an idea forward, and I got some feedback. I'll tell you later what the feedback was, but I'm curious if this group has different or similar feedback. We had to get our heads wrapped around something. I said this community's grown in just the last 40 years or so. Here's their water pipes. This is where it made sense for them. It clicked. Their water pipes by when they were built, kind of roughly decades here. If it's dark green, it's really new. And the more it goes to light green and then to light brown and then to dark brown, the older it gets. And if you look at this map for a minute, you're probably going to see what me and the community saw. Wait, hold on. Why are those old downtown pipes brand new? And that's where it started to click. They're like, oh yeah, we paid for that giant, expensive, disruptive project to take care of those pipes that were so old, we didn't really have a choice anymore. We had to work on those pipes. That made this real for them. Then we aligned it on a chart to try to help make sense of how things are distributed. We'll point back out again that, okay, some of those 2010-ish or last decade pipes, those are really the rebuilds of those pipes from back there. But if that project was big and painful and expensive, all that does is get you to right here. This is where you are now. And everything to the right of this line is all the work you're going to have to do. Here's what the next 20 years look like. We crossed a lot of territory. There's a whole lot of blue bar there that's going to have to go yellow by spending a whole lot of money. That's a different perspective. That's how we at Urban 3 like to look at infrastructure. And that's what we're trying to help the community see so that as they talk about their change and their pathway going forward, they can decide what they can afford and how they want to pay for it. This is one of our icons we like to bring back to. That's what we mean. How are you going to manage it if you can't measure it? So my next step was that I finally get to talk about the fiscal implications with them. And this is where it starts to get really juicy. Like I said, we've split the whole city into grids. So here are all the grids with both their costs in red, distributed, the whole thing, everything they need to spend according to the way we look at those water pipes. And on the right, where their revenues come from, you see giant spikes. I know I'm going super fast here, but you see giant spikes that are all about where that retail tax is coming to. We can net those against each other, and we can see that certain land uses are real winners for them. So now they've got some insight going forward, and certain land uses really need some subsidy. They really need something else because they have a lot of cost and revenues don't come from those land uses. Or we can roll the whole budget back up in one simple chart. Let's talk about the bottom line for this corporate entity that is Edmond. There's all their revenue. Let's compare it to their costs. And it turns out, if we're realistic about all those water pipe costs we're going to face, they've already got a deficit. They're already starting to fall behind. Again, that worked for the community. They were like, yeah, my roads aren't in the condition I wish they were in. And that's where I'm guessing some of you have the same problem. Some of your roads probably aren't, or pipes aren't in the condition you wish they were in, but we probably also haven't been looking at our costs and our revenues this way. So the last step in Edmond was that we get to talk about, well, okay, let's try out some different futures and see what we can do. Skipping over all of the how, here's the conclusion of 5 different scenarios that they came up with. Let's try what we're already doing. Let's try what's in our plan. Let's try really doing what's in our plan, some stuff in between. Each one of these keeps netting out negative because frankly, these were all a lot like the community they already are that is already facing a deficit. So that got them to a place that they never thought they'd get to. Those conversations with the public where people said, we want trees and we want some different options, allowed us to propose a different alternative where all of the new growth you see here, this is just lit up by color and height for how much, what kind of thing would we add in this new scenario, that this is radical and wild for Edmond. If you're going to grow on the east side, it's got to be in little compact villages that are almost rivaling the existing downtown. But you know what? The existing downtown needs to grow up too. This scenario is more or less, in my opinion, from what I've taken in over the years in CNU, this is just urban style development. And frankly, what it is a little more sharing, a little more stuff to help pay for all of that infrastructure. What that comes back and does to the fiscal implications for their scenario was that it gets them close. They're still negative, but it gets them close. And frankly, they literally this week adopted this plan and its recommendations that they go forward with, figuring out what other changes do they need to put into place to actually move in this direction and actually start filling in the hole they dug themselves to become a fiscally sustainable place. That, I know I did that super fast, but that was a huge movement, we think. And we think that this problem, that was a huge advance on what they were willing to talk about, because we worked with them to come up with these scenarios and then iterate. I think, Maxine, that's where I should cut myself off for a minute, because I've gone on and on, and I get super excited about this. But this is the gist, the long gist of something that I think is viable and available for other communities to also think about, because I don't think Edmond's alone in this problem.
Thank you so much for letting us know. And we are going to be having a discussion. I do have a question for you, but first we're going to jump to Taylor's presentation. So we spent our time talking about the finances of urbanism. Let's zoom in further with the people. What does community involvement look like?
Thank you, Maxine. So like Maxine said, we'll be talking a little bit about public engagement. This was part of a session called Nature's Silver Bullets, an equitable approach to for a cooler planet. Okay. So I am an analyst at Urban 3. I joined the team in the beginning of November, but I previously worked for a design firm based in Charleston, and I was presenting on one of their projects at the CNU. So this project is the City of Charleston Parks and Recreation Master Plan for the year 2020. The project was led by Branstetter Carroll, and Circulus, the firm that I worked at, was contracted to do the community engagement. So this project began in the spring of 2020. So as you can imagine, public engagement changed a lot over that time. As many of you may know, public meetings can be very limiting, especially for those who work outside of a 9-to-5 schedule, rely on public transportation, and or don't have access to childcare in the evenings. COVID additionally made large public meetings less realistic, so we decided to pivot our public engagement strategy. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but we really used COVID as an excuse to pivot our public engagement strategy. As part of the city's RFP, they were okay with doing an online and mail-in survey and public meetings. And because we know, some of the limitations to large public meetings, we wanted to go meet the people where they were. And so that my note would to designers and professionals would just be that just because it's not listed in the RFP doesn't mean that as long as you fulfill all of those requirements, you can't push yourself to go above and beyond in the name of equitable public engagement. So we decided to get out into the parks. Myself and my boss at the time, Aaron Stevens, wanted to meet people where they were. So we developed a series of survey questions, put on bright green t-shirts, and went to talk to people while they were using the parks and recreation spaces. For those unfamiliar with Charleston, the city is made up of a series of peninsulas and islands. We focused outreach on 19 different parks and recreation spaces. So the city actually is this peninsula here down to the center peninsula, and then this is West Ashley, James Island, and Johns Island. We visited each park for 2 to 4 hours each day at different times, early mornings, afternoon, evenings, and weekends, to target the busiest hours and talk to a variety of users. Initially, we did have some challenges. First, because people were actively using the parks, they were not always willing to stop to talk to us. After a little bit of trial and error, we found to be most successful asking to walk and talk with residents. So we walked many laps while people pushed strollers, walked dogs, and answered our survey questions. Another challenge that we faced, particularly in the Kanehoy region of the city, which is newly being developed from farmland into more residential properties, is that they don't have any existing parks and recreation spaces. The city wants to survey residents, or wanted to survey residents to figure out what spaces they would like. But because of that, we didn't have a specific space that we could target residents. And so we decided to go to the grocery store. However, we were kicked out because surveying and loitering is not allowed at Publix. So public engagement works better in public spaces for this reason. Because of the project timeline, we conducted the majority of our engagement in August and September, which are hot, humid months in Charleston during hurricane season. So we did occasionally have to reschedule due to weather, but we were still able to get in all of our park visits as planned. Overall, the public engagement process was really successful. We found that by meeting people where they were, we were able to get real, authentic feedback from active users of the space. A lot of people wouldn't typically be willing to give up their afternoon workout or their time spent in the park in order to go sit inside at a public meeting. And so this strategy was really successful for this project. We were also able to talk about successes and challenges of the actual space that we're actively a part of and point things out as an example and then take note on our survey. We found that a lot of people just didn't know about the spaces, activities, and programs available to them through the city, and that in addition to designing and funding great spaces, public education and marketing is also extremely important. As with most public engagement processes, we dealt with contradictory feedback. For example, at one park, we got comments about the goose poop and people not enjoying that, and then other residents who specifically come to the park to feed the geese as one of their favorite activities. So we compiled all of our data, quantitative and qualitative, to include in the master plan. This included survey questions designed to be accessible in terms of language. So not only were we trying to make ourselves physically accessible by meeting people where they were in the park, but also designing our questions so they included accessible language that anyone could easily understand. We surveyed, seniors all the way down to small children. So some of the questions we asked were, for example, what is your favorite thing to do at this or any other park? Do you prefer casual pickup games or more organized leagues? Where are you from? How do you come here? What mode of transit, or do you bike, walk, etc.? How often do you come here? What other parks do you frequent? And then notes on overall facilities and services that they would like added to the park system. We did include a section for observations. For example, a lot of people told us that bathrooms and accessibility were a big consideration when going to the park, particularly for people with small children. They didn't feel comfortable going to a park further outside of their neighborhood or across town if they knew that their small child was going to have to use the bathroom and there weren't facilities there. A lot of facilities had been closed during COVID, and so we wanted to push the city to find a safe way for them to keep those open. Additionally, safety and security was such a frequent concern and topic of conversation that we decided to create its own subsection addressing concerns like visibility, playground equipment safety, and emergency response time. So the data was aggregated for each park and recreation spaces that we surveyed. So this is an example of the Herbert High School pool and some of the statistics that went along with it. And then this is another example from Hampton Park, which we did 2 separate visits to this space, one in the morning and one in the evening, to understand what kind of users are in the space. We found another finding we had was that people come back to parks that they find beautiful, and that maintenance makes a big difference. So people, it kind of serves as a positive cycle of people love beautiful parks, they feel more pride in the space, they're more willing to volunteer to maintain them, and then those parks stay beautiful. Whereas parks that aren't very well taken care of or aren't very beautiful, then people are less likely to visit, they're less likely to volunteer unless it's some large effort to renovate the park. We also found that parks sustain communities. For example, this is Hampstead Park. In this park, community elders line up in chairs in the shade next to the corner store that's across the street from the playground and basketball court area. One man we met drives 30 minutes each day from where he lives now back to this community that he grew up in to hang out with his childhood friends. By having this line of elders across the street, they're able to provide safety and security for the space. And so parents feel okay letting their children play, even if they're still at home, some work around the house or cooking dinner or something like that. The biggest difference that we found came with spaces that had a community champion. For example, Mr. Jones at Martin Park has been working for the city for over 27 years, and his work primarily focuses on the East Side community, where pre-COVID he was entertaining a group of 75 to 80 kids after school every single day. They have a community center and playground as well as sports fields here. He even advocated to get funding for a computer lab, which now exists in the community center for children who don't have computer or Wi-Fi access at home to complete their homework. And they also run rec leagues and sports teams through this community center. And Mr. Jones will call and check in with teachers to make sure that students have their homework done before they get to participate in games. A community champion is also Peggy Bone, director of the Farmfield Tennis Center in West Ashley, where she has worked for 45 years. Each year, she advocates for funding and organizes lessons, tournaments, and leagues to get people more involved in the game of tennis. And because of this, tennis is a sport that's really blossomed in the city of Charleston. And last, but certainly not least, every park needs a champion like Katina Stroud. Katina works at the Martin Luther King Jr. and Herbert Hazel pools in downtown Charleston, which are each located next to a public housing community where swimming rates are low. And in a city that frequently gets hit by hurricanes and flooding, the ability to swim can be the difference between life and death. The public pools in the city of Charleston cost $2, but this is largely inaccessible to some of the community and the families that live in public housing. So seeing this, Katina launched a fundraiser which raised over $18,000 and collected hundreds of swimsuits. So now citizens can take free swim lessons with the city. They don't have to pay for the cost to swim, and they have swimsuits that are provided. In addition, they also provide snacks during the summer because our pools are open to anybody above the age of 7. You can come without an adult. You just need to come with a friend, or it can be another minor that's also above the age of 7 because they are lifeguard supervised. And so it serves as a sort of after school program, even in the summer. So overall, we learned public outreach is extremely important. We knew that, but specifically the methods that you use to conduct public outreach. It's important to consider every user and meet them where they are. Designing places that attract and retain community champions. So as part of CNU, there was a larger discussion that really began, and we really started diving deeper into the conversation of equity at this year's CNU. So I'm taking these definitions from Mitchell Silver, former Department of Planning for Raleigh and Director of Parks for the City of New York. In my education, I learned the importance of designing with people and not for people, or for communities. And I think that or at least I hope that as CNU continues, we spend more time focusing on how these principles can be implemented and affect our work. So diversity, each of these words have a lot of connotations or complex definitions. And so Mitchell broke these down in a really easily understandable way. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the value of different perspectives. We're talking about equity, we mean fairness, inclusion, a space must be welcoming to all, and access or removing barriers. So with this project, like I said, we tried to access people by going to where they were instead of making them come to us. This project wasn't perfect. Our team happened to be 2 white women, so there was still some access or barriers because of that, and we didn't have funding to hire anybody else from the community to help us go ask these questions. But we were able to talk to a lot more diverse users than we would have necessarily been able to had we just had large public forums in the evenings that tend to attract the same community members over and over. So why does this matter at CNU? I'm not going to read this full slide, don't worry. But in 1996, the Charter for the New Urbanism was ratified, and it included the following pillars: advocating for universally accessible public spaces and community institutions, recognizing that physical solutions by themselves will not solve social and economic problems without a coherent and supportive physical framework, and to represent a broad-based citizenry through citizen-based participatory planning and design. So thank you. This is the website you can learn more about the project. And we'll turn it back over to you, Maxine.
Thank you for speaking with us about your project, Taylor. I'd like the audience to know that Taylor created the graphic designs for her presentation. So can I get a quick clap reaction if you should make a children's book out of it? So for the next 20 minutes, I would like us to have a discussion with our guest speakers. So if you could come on up and show yourselves. We've got a couple questions for you, and then I'll move on to Q&A so our audience can ask our speakers some questions too. So first, Josh, I have a question for you. We're going to go back to public assets. We're going to zoom out. I'd like to tell the audience what you think of the pit of despair is and what it is.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's come up in any of these other decoders, but I'll give a little explanation. And pit of despair is it's the locally known term for this thing. You all know it's across the street from our office, actually. But it's a property that the city of Asheville acquired at some point, and it's not a unique story, really. I think the reason I brought it up is I think every city probably has something like this that you at home probably can imagine. Some property that's in your city, often downtown, often surrounded by very valuable development that's just kind of there. And sometimes it's where garbage trucks get stored, or sometimes it's just parking lot. Sometimes it's maybe an underutilized office building. We also have a federal post office downtown that's got a huge parking lot. So I brought that up in part so that since it's the pit of despair, we can all talk about Andy from Parks and Rec falling in the pit, and it gave me a good opportunity to talk about finances falling in the pit, because one of the weird things that happened is that part of the problem with the site, and it's just these sites can become contentious, is that some people propose a park on it. I think Taylor's right there. I can't say bad things about parks right here, right now, but the weird thing is, at the same time, the city of Asheville has a budget deficit and was considering cutting back on park spending. So we have a dilemma. How can we add more parks if we can't afford the parks? And so I brought that up. If I were to take this site and I could do a whole talk at CNU on, look at this cool site the city owns, how could we accommodate these different wants, these different asks of the site? I think we could build a very valuable building to generate revenue for the city, to fix problems, and also provide some sort of open space, some sort of recreation, find a way to achieve these policy aims while also, using the land better. And I think for new urbanism, I think it's also a matter of all the money aside, and sort of why I like the work we do is I see it as trying to support good design by making the financial case. That the people who are really good at that can look at this and say, okay, here's what would work there really well.
Yes,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that was great. As a citizen of Asheville, and since the office is right across from the Pit of Despair, it would be great to see that space being utilized purposefully. Like, I would love to sit outside and eat lunch right across from where I work. So Philip, I have a question for you. You were able to do an analysis in areas that were close to home, and you were able to see not just the revenue, but the costs. What was your reaction to this?
So there were a couple of surprises for me. I didn't actually, I mentioned the biases that I had going in. Edmond thinks of itself and is thought of as a relatively affluent community. I was surprised that they weren't more valuable than they turned out to be when we did the value per acre. And there were COVID weirdnesses about this project, but in the same way that I think Taylor found, some of our team actually got out in front of a Walmart and actually got good input, which was great. And I'm glad that we pushed to do that because it did take time and effort and it was a change. But I think it's part of what got the community. This was the other surprise to me. That community would not have, and has actually recently chosen not to, approve the kinds of things that we talked about in this plan. But we got real engagement and we got real, or so far, at least through the council meeting, we have a real indication that this community is ready for change, readier than I thought they would be. And actually, the third thing that I think was a real big surprise to me, when we communicated this way, with simple slides, here's your math, here it is, we do the math, it's not looking so good. People were able to take that and say, yeah, well, they didn't scare them nearly as much as I expected. They had a much better attitude about it. And I think that's reflecting something that kind of came out of, and I don't know, Josh, if you were in this conversation at CNU, one of the other things that happens is the impromptu meetings in the hall where 5 people start having a conversation and then they miss a whole session. But we got to this really fun conversation about, well, has CNU actually been around long enough that it's worked, that people are getting how valuable, how useful some good, walkable, human-oriented places are. And so we've not entirely, I showed you the model of Oklahoma City and Edmond. We have not entirely solved that problem, but that's at least sort of solved. And that's why we're actually now in this place to try to think about, well, what next? Okay, so we can stomach some change. Now let's talk about how we're going to do it. That to me has been a paradigm shift in Oklahoma, of all places. I'm sure that I know there are other places that are ahead of Oklahoma still, but that is actually a huge step forward in that process of, well, how are we going to grow up and become resilient and sustainable? I don't know, Josh, if you heard that conversation that CNU has almost outgrown its roots, not entirely, but a little bit. I think the argument is that CNU has made progress. So now it's time to start thinking about, well, what's the next step?
Right. What is the next step for next 100 years? Or we can even go to the next step for the next 3 generations. Taylor, I loved that you included the charter in your presentation. And I noticed that they use the words restoration and restructuring in their first 2 principles. So I'm wondering, what does that mean for redevelopment? And what do you think about gentrification with the CNU charter?
Yeah, that's a big question, and certainly one that a lot of people are trying to figure out. I think it's, the I can't speak to when the charter was founded because I wasn't exactly there. I imagine that they had the best intentions and were looking at cities that have industrial areas or, vacant areas and that are also close to a city center and figuring out how to do infill. At Urban 3, we certainly understand that when we do the math for cities, the easiest way for them to increase their tax-based revenue without incurring any additional cost from new utility lines is to do that infill development, renovate existing buildings and therefore have a smaller impact on the environment or ideally at least, because you're working within the frame of something that exists. You're not doing, greenfield development where you're starting from scratch. I think the problem is that, there weren't necessarily people that lived in those sorts of neighborhoods that were included in writing the original documents for CNU. And so now we've kind of we've created this problem where we had white flight, people moved out to the suburbs and left these downtowns. A lot of them then struggled with vacancy and, just financial solvency. And then now that we're using these new urbanist principles, we've actually recognized like, hey, the suburbs may not necessarily be where we want to be. We actually would prefer to not have to get in our car to go somewhere. It's better for humans to, use public transit, live in a walkable city, have public spaces and public parks easily accessible to you, have this sense of community that you may not necessarily have in your residential area. And so now we've said, hey, we wanted something else, but we're going to leave this for you. And now we've changed our mind. So we're going to come back and take that from you and gentrify those areas. And I think my hope at least is that now that CNU is starting to talk about those things, we'll be able to find a solution. Because I certainly am not going to be able to solve it by myself.
Thank you for your input. And for the audience, I'm going to go ahead and paste the link to CNU if you want to learn more about their Congress. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to Q&A. Thank you for the discussion. We have some great questions, and I'd like to start off with a question from Tiffany Owens. At CNU, she felt like she heard two things. On one hand, the desire to be equitable and open to all, but on the other hand, a frustration with public engagement precisely because they were open to all. Several people mentioned the need to organize public engagement so that we can attract qualified voices and people who are interested in participating over the long haul. How do you think we should balance the call for equitable engagement, hearing from everyone, with a proven need to organize public engagement opportunities so that they can attract qualified and committed participants?
I can go ahead and start that off, or Josh, if you wanted to.
To start us off, Taylor.
Yeah, I know I wasn't in the particular session, but I know that there was a session that talked about public engagement and particularly for new development, talking to more than just the people that live on that block. Because if you've ever done this as your work, you do enough public engagement meetings, you start to realize that it's likely like the same 20 or 30 people that just keep coming back to every single one and have an opinion on everything. At the same time, like that's kind of, the glory and the fall of democracy is like we all have a vote whether or not you're educated on the actual candidates. You can't just say like, hey, you need to have a degree in politics or you need to have a degree in economics to be able to vote for a president. And so I think public engagement works the same way. I think for that reason, it's important to make sure that you are talking to a variety of people. And even if you think like somebody's not an expert, like, we work in our fields and we know a lot, and then we're asking other people who have no experience, in city planning or parks and those things to have a say on those subjects. And so part of the public engagement process really needs to be public education, and explaining the basics as simply as possible so that as many people as possible can be involved in the conversation, and continuing it as a conversation. And so, you know, this is not the only project I've done public engagement for. We worked on flooding in the city of Charleston too. And what we actually found was that it was really important to continue when people would answer a question, or you'd ask a question, people would answer it, to continue it as part of a conversation, to understand more their reasoning than maybe necessarily their actual answer. Because a lot of people have the same priorities and the same, you know, thing that they're trying to get out. Or, you know, if you ask them a question, for example, like, how do you want, which park do you want, or what do you, so I guess I don't really have a great example, but we found that basically people would have different answers, but they had the same priorities. They just maybe didn't necessarily have the education to know the step to what they wanted. And so learning more and educating people before beginning that process is super important.
And there's something I wanted to say about that, which I think what Taylor, well, I don't know which side she's on your screen. She's on this side for me. Taylor. What Taylor has done that's really fabulous, I think, in her presentation is that this is, I think, the danger. It's always the danger for planners, is that this is the new, better way to do it, and that's not actually the lesson there. I think it's experimentation. Is that whatever you come show up with, even if it's Taylor's great approach, maybe that won't end up not being right. So being able to experiment with something new. And I think there's going to be some failed experiments. And to that end, one that I think is promising that I got to be a part of is in Eugene, Oregon. One thing they tried is for a public process related to the statewide changes to single family zoning. I think they must have used the jury rolls, and they had a representative sample of their community, different demographics, parts of the city, incomes, all that stuff, and they paid them for their time to be professional public input. And they even gave them the option to hire, to bring in guest witnesses to answer questions for them. So I got to be one to talk about the financial impacts of missing middle. And the other piece too is that in a lot of cases, I think, I can't remember who it is who put it this way, but I really like it, that we have processes that are comfortable to politicians and comfortable to people on the inside, and not comfortable to the public. And anytime it's like that, I think it's doomed.
I think that's very possible. I'll add one more wrinkle that we saw in Edmond. A hybrid approach was working. Getting out there with the public was working, but we also had one of those classic comprehensive planning process committees who stuck with us and who learned with us. And now I'm going to actually transition, Maxine, to Max's question. We'll see. That committee stuck with us. If they can get the zoning code changes to actually happen that they want to do, and if that committee can help provide enough framework for the public, what we try to do when we present these fiscal realities is say, look, that's the hole you're in. Now, to get out of it, you could raise your taxes a lot. I've never seen anybody say they really wanted to do that. We could let all your streets go to gravel and your water pipes break. Nobody wants to do that. Or we could build these other new buildings to help you pay without generating a whole lot of more cost with them. And so far, they're telling us that they're liking that. They can see the issue and they're liking that as the solution. So hopefully we get there, but that's really what our work can do, is help them change the conversation, hopefully with a broader public support, and they'll carry that forward. And actually, I can even go back and answer Chris's question. As a small builder, if you want to be a part of that, everywhere we go, see townhomes. Townhomes are some of the most productive thing. They're still almost single family. If you could build single family, you can probably build townhomes. Some of the best stuff in Edmonds downtown is townhomes. I think that's a great next marginal step. If somebody wants to start building townhomes, start creating a block, a half a block, a fraction of a block of urbanism at a time, that really is something that if you want to do, I think you're going to find a lot of support in anywhere that's looking at their books and seeing some trouble.
Thank you, Philip. And for the audience, Max was asking what fiscal arguments we've made for mixed use and higher density. and if they found general public support. And Chris was wondering what small builders could do to facilitate new urbanism. So I'm looking at the time and we are almost at 2 p.m. I would like to thank you so much for the questions you had. We've had a lot of fun this hour, and I'd like to end with some finishing notes. First, I'd like to say thank you so much for your support for the Decoder webinar during the pandemic. We have enjoyed sharing our insights on city planning and finances and inequity in different communities across the United States. With that, we are having a slight transition where our Decoder webinar is going to be quarterly instead of every month. So we'll see you in July. We will have Stacy Mitchell discuss the dark store fallacy. And you can register through our website or through the link that will be posted on the chat box. Want to work with us? You can email Kate Ryba, which is our Chief Operating Officer, for projects, and Caitlin Nellis-Masters for lectures. I'd like to thank you again for attending this month's webinar, and we hope to see you in July.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to chat with everyone.